out to get 150 millionaires who weren't paying their fair share. And now almost everybody on the East Coast and West Coast and some on the Gulf Coast, on the wealthier states, are being hit with an alternative minimum tax. Nobody intends for that to happen, so it'll eventually get patched. I don't know why it's not in there. I wasn't in on it, but eventually that will change. That just tells you what's wrong with our tax code. We have an alternative minimum tax, and every year we patch it. That's kind of like saying we have a debt ceiling, but every time we come up against it, we raise it. We have no debt ceiling, and we don't have any alternative minimum tax. It's a small one, but what normally would come through, we fix every year. So that tells you the dishonesty of the process. And that's why what we need to do, actually, I believe what we ought to do is by April 15th of next year, we ought to pass a bill right now that says April 15th of next year, the tax code as we know it is dead. Now, what are the revenue requirements that will not hurt growth in the economy that needs to come to the federal government? And what are the real things that we need to be spending money on in terms of expenditures outside entitlements? What is it required to fund that? And by the way, can we continue funding our entitlement programs the way they are without reforming them and have a viable future? And the fact is had we reformed Medicare when the Bush tax cuts went through, and had we modified discretionary spending, we would be in surplus right now. In other words, had we paid for the Bush tax cuts by offsetting the additional tax revenue that was going to be decreased by decreasing the federal government, the federal government would be in surplus right now. We wouldn't be in trouble, and we wouldn't have $15 trillion worth of debt, in spite of the two wars. So, the idea is, my background, most people know me as a physician, but I'm an accountant by my original degree and training, and spent 9 years in business. We continue to shoot ourselves in the foot over political positioning rather than doing the best right thing for the country. And we don't have a problem in front of us we can't fix. What we lack is the courage and leadership in Washington to address it and not worry about whether or not you're going to get reelected. And it's time that that's what needs to happen, because the country is facing in the very near future much more difficult problems than we've ever faced in our life in terms of what's going to be the consequence of our spending and borrowing against the future.
Looking back, Senator Coburn, was there a time when the Gang of Six could have come and made a difference?
Yeah, I think that's true. We could have, but we had to come together, and it was also a time there was actual better policies out there that I agreed with more than I agreed with the Gang. Cut, cap, and balance, I actually agree with more than the Gang of Six. It actually would have accomplished more. But nevertheless, we did come to an agreement which raised revenue and cut expenses and cut entitlements, not to the degree that we have to, but did make a first step towards that. So, I think I'd make another point. One of the reasons we're in trouble as a country isn't because we can't get along and pass bills. It's because we've got along and passed bills that we shouldn't have. Otherwise, we wouldn't be running trillion-dollar deficits and wouldn't have a tax code that's disproportionate, wouldn't be funding millionaires on unemployment, or all these other things, which comes to about $28 billion a year in terms of tax loopholes. We get along too well when it comes to helping our friends. And I would tell you we'd be in much better shape had we not passed a whole lot of it.
Next call for Senator Coburn comes from Largo, Florida. Scott on our Democrats line. You're on the Washington Journal.
Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
First, let me correct you on something. The reason that the Senate is not getting bills passed is because of the Republican filibusters, I believe. But anyway, let's get to the tax issue.
Well, let me correct you there for a minute. First of all, since Mr. Reed's been majority leader, he has filled the tree 42 times and filed cloture before the bill's even been on the floor. What that says is, here's a bill, you can have no amendments. Why would we vote for that? That's 42 out of the 65 filibusters. So I don't think you are accurate when you say we have filibustered. You call for a filibuster as soon as you don't allow any amendments and don't allow any input from the minority in the Senate. The Senate was designed so that everybody has a voice, whether you're the leader or you're the lowest member of the Senate. And what Senator Reid has done has essentially shut out the voice of 40 states and their input.
Go ahead,
Senator,
Scott.
remember the statement from the Republican leader that we're going to make our job is to make Obama a one-term president. So let me get to the tax issue. Our founding fathers intentionally made the tax system the way it is because they understood that with a balanced budget amendment, there were going to be times when the government is not bringing in things like today's economy, where the government needs to help people, and they need to spend more money. So they can't have a balanced budget and just spend the 18% like the Republicans want to do. And as far as the payroll tax goes, in Florida, the minimum wage is $7.67. Last December, they changed it to a 2% payroll tax. That means that the person making $7.67, instead of getting the original $400 tax break that Obama had put in, he's now getting $319. That means he's paying $80.93 for someone who's making more money to get more than the $400.
Senator?
Well, I'm not sure I know his point. The first thing is our founders didn't have an income tax. That came far later. What our founders did say is you never borrow money or create a spending program with which you haven't laid a tax for. And I would tell you both parties have been totally guilty of doing that. We just think about Medicare Part D. Medicare Part D is a $14 trillion charge to your children that nobody has ever paid the revenue on, and yet we've promised a benefit. And so when that was passed, that was done as a political maneuver during the second Bush election that would take the price of prescription drugs off the table. So now we're going to charge $14 trillion to kids that aren't even born yet to pay for the prescription drugs of seniors today. I'm all for reforming the tax code. I'm all for everybody paying an equal amount, a fair share, as the president says. But when the top 20% in this country pay 80% of all federal income taxes, I don't think you can make a logical case that they're not paying enough. What we've done is the federal government's twice the size it was 10 years ago. And so we can have the round-the-corner debate, should we grow government or should we shrink government? Should we raise taxes? Which comes first? I will tell you, with a government that's twice the size it was 10 years ago, my vote's to make the government smaller. And I have a lot to back that up. We have $200 billion worth of duplications in programs. And let me just give a couple examples of that. There's 47 job training programs. We spend $18 billion on them a year. They're from 9 different agencies, and not one of them has a metric, and all but 3 overlap one another. Why would we spend $18 billion on 47 separate federal job training programs? We have 82 teacher training programs. 82 run by the federal government. Not one of them has a metric on it to say whether it's working. Why do we need 82? How about 1, if in fact that's a role for the federal government? So what we've done is had incompetent Congresses and incompetent oversight of this federal government, and when there's a legitimate role, we ought to make sure we're doing it efficiently and effectively.
Next call for Senator Coburn comes from Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. Carl, on our Republican line, you're on the Washington Journal.
Yes, sir. You're the one man that I would like to see run for president. I would love to see you in that White House for the next 8 years, because when you talk, the common man, the average man such as myself, can understand what you're saying. Most of these politicians talk in circles that the average people just do not understand. And I'm glad you gave that Democrat a history lesson on when our income tax started. Thank you.
Well, the only thing I'm running for is dinner. I'm in my last term as a U.S. Senator. One of the things I think that gives me insight is I'm term limited. I think that'd be a great application across the board in Washington. I think it limits it makes you focus on what is really important, why I'm here, what we do. We do more oversight than most other Senate offices. We actually know what we're talking about. We've actually researched it. We're the #1 utilizer of the GAO. We're the #1 utilizer of the Congressional Research Service. They are fantastic organizations. And just to tell you how politics works, the GAO got its budget cut twice as much as the Senate got its budget cut this year, because they didn't like some of the reports they were putting out. and so there's kind of, we're going to spank you because you've embarrassed us because we weren't doing our job. They are key. Americans ought to say, we want GAO funded, we want congressional research, because that's where a lot of the knowledge is that will come to solve our problems.
Your term limits is self-imposed, correct?
That's right.
When is your term up?
I ran again in 2010, so I'll be out in 2016.
And why do you do that?
Well, number one is, first of all, the assumption of not accepting term limits is nobody can do this as good as I can. That's the first thing. That's arrogance. Arrogance leads to poor judgment. Number two, positions of power breed arrogance, which leads to poor judgment, which we've seen a lot of. Number three is our founders, if you go back and read, they believed in the concept of rotation. None of them, with the exception of Alexander Hamilton, believed people ought to make a career in politics. Most of them couldn't believe that anybody would be so stupid as to make a career in politics. This was supposed to be about service for the country, not service for the individual. And what we see conflict in, both Republican and Democrat, is you see this tension and conflict over what's best for my political career versus what's best for the country. And too often, what's best for the political career wins. And that's not healthy for the country. So I think a constitutional amendment, which we'll never get unless we have a constitutional convention, because the people up here will never vote themselves term limits, but the concept of term limits. But American voters can force term limits because they can say, unless you're going to adhere to a self-imposed term limit, we're not going to vote for you.
Any thought about running for president?
Oh, I've had thoughts of it, especially with what I think is the weakness of our potential nominees right now, but nothing serious, and probably don't have the skill set that's necessary for that.
From Rock Dots, this tweet: Senator Coburn, you've indicated your displeasure with Newt Gingrich as a potential nominee, but say he wins. Who would you vote for?
I'd probably vote for Newt Gingrich, simply because when you're limited to two options, you get one of two options. But I don't think first of all, one of my disgusts with our media today is the headline every day is about the Republican race. We have a whole lot more important things on our plate right now than that. And when we concentrate on that, means we're not concentrating on these very real problems in front of our country. We have $15.3 trillion worth of debt. And if interest rates rise 1 point, we spend an additional $160 billion a year on interest. That's $160 billion that we will have to cut from other programs. If they rise 2 points, that's $320 billion. And you think about that our debt is, our net interest cost the lowest it's ever been as far as rate, and our maturity of our debt is the shortest it's ever been, which means when interest rates rise, and they are going to rise for us because there's going to become a point in time when people aren't going to loan us money, much like what Europe's going through, if we haven't made the hard choices ahead of time. And so I think we need to be concentrating on how do we reform our entitlements, how do we reform the tax code, how do we create a vibrant economy that is based on a tax code that is fair but yet causes capital to flow into job creation. That's what we need to do. And nobody's doing that. We're not working on the real problems. We're working on the political sparring and the, quote, threat of a shutdown and we're not going to do. None of that's going to happen, but that makes for great news. None of that is going to happen. And all the politicians know it. It's how do they posture? America's sick of posturing. They want to hear what are the real problems, what are the possible solutions. They're grown-ups. We're the ones that are not acting like grown-ups.
Phil is an independent in Summerville, South Carolina. Phil, you're on the Washington Journal with Senator Coburn.
Morning, Phil.
Good morning, Senator. How are you?
I'm fine.
Great. Hey, I called with really two things in mind that I wanted to talk about. Number one was the term limit issue, which I wholeheartedly believe that that's the only way this is going to be fixed because of what you said about the fact that everybody's looking out for their own interest as opposed to looking out for what's good for the country. You see it day in and day out if you pay attention to this stuff. So that one's been kind of touched a little bit already. The other thing I wanted to talk about was how I would support you wholeheartedly in a run for president. You talked about your skill set. You have the skill set. It's obvious, and it was brought up, I think, by the guy, well, it's about 3 callers back, who said that you speak in a way that the common people can understand. I don't necessarily always agree with you on everything. There have been a few times that I've been disappointed in some of your positions. But
so is my wife.
In the grand scheme of things, you're the guy who I think is most qualified to lead this country, and I think you really ought to step up.
Well, I have great difficulty trying to do that.
Jay Hill in Jacksonville, Florida emails into you, Senator. There is one thing which would resolve the political brinkmanship exhibited in Congress, and that would be to only create single-focus bills. Why is this nonsense of allowing things that are totally unrelated to the issue so pervasive, such as, and he uses the Keystone Pipeline issue in the House?
Well, I would tend to disagree with him. First of all, the way the Senate works, or it doesn't work in the last 4 years, the way it's worked before that was you could do that because you had an open amendment process. Every senator's rights were protected. People wouldn't offer stupid amendments or multiple amendments. What they would do is they'd go down, make a serious amendment, lose it, and then after they lost, they'd think 2 or 3 times about another amendment and probably wouldn't offer it. Now we have everybody wanting to offer amendments because you can't. And so you have this tension. The Senate was designed to function on the basis of mutual respect. Everybody had a privilege, but that privilege should not be taken advantage of. And the way I believe Senator Reid has run the Senate is he's ruined the decorum because he's trying to protect people from votes. And look, this is a big boys' town, big girls' town. If you can't defend your vote to your constituents, you have no business being here in the first place. But you have no honor if you're not going to take votes. In other words, because you're not doing the job. Not taking the vote is not doing the job. And I can't tell you my frustration and disappointment. And Republicans have done this too. Don't let me just, they have worsened it, but it's much more exaggerated now than it's ever been. Well, it's dysfunctional. And I'll tell you the thing we need. We don't need single bills. We need real leadership in this country that recognizes with leadership comes severe criticism and a stern evaluation of what you're doing. And with real leadership, you can very plainly and cogently explain what you're trying to do and defend it. But not leading and not defending and not having a great answer for the American people means we don't have the qualities necessary for our houses to work. And I think that's what the election ought to be about, is where's the real leader? When you look at the presidential, even including the president, where's the description of the problem in front of us? It's not just class warfare and dividing America that our problem is. Our problem is we're highly in debt. We're spending more money than we have. We're spending money we don't have on things we don't need. We're in 2 wars. We're weak in terms of our foreign policy because we're weak economically, and our future is at stake. Where's your plan? Republican candidates and president, where's your plan to solve the very real problems in front of us as a nation? And none of them have a plan. And America is owed a plan. How do you intend to handle what's in front of us? The very real issue of Europe coming apart in terms of the euro and the impact on it. How do we handle that? And what is our obligation to those that follow us if we do we not have an obligation to handle it the best way? And where's the discussion in the presidential race about what the real problems are in this country? Nobody's talking about them. They're just kind of covering them up so thinking the American people don't know. The American people know we're in trouble. And what they want is real leadership that will address those problems specifically with specific answers, specific things. And then let's have the debate. But not having the debate is not healthy for us as a nation.
Well, just to follow that up, Joseph Ramirez tweets into you, Senator Coburn, foot-dragging politicians who run against the federal government want it to fail. Is that the problem?
Well, I think, look, I will honestly say I've been disappointed in Washington since I've been in politics. And I've been highly critical of it. But I think it deserves it. I mean, just think for a minute. We have a foreign policy where we've given foreign aid out to 16 different countries that own more than $10 billion worth of our debt. In other words, we're borrowing money from foreign countries, and we're turning around and giving them foreign aid. If they've got enough money to loan us $10 to $100 billion each, why are we giving? So I can show you what's wrong. Those are the symptoms of the problem. The problem is the lack of oversight, the lack of attentiveness of both the administration and members of Congress in fixing the very real problems. So, look, the reason people don't have confidence in Congress today isn't Republican or Democrat, it's career politicians in both parties.
Robert, Republican, Champaign, Illinois, good morning to you.
Well, good morning to you also. We've got three states, real quick ones.
Okay.
I think he should run for president, and I think that the term limits is a good thing, but we do have a good chance for term limits. It's coming up here in 2012. Vote them out. Anyone that's in there, get rid of them when they've been there more than 6 or 8 years, same as our Democratic senator from Illinois. I mean, he's a ridiculous guy, but he's been in there so long because that Chicago, they let dogs vote up there. And I'll put it another way, to solve the balance payments, you could do away with percentage raises. What's 2% of nothing? It makes the people getting the most get the most. Within two raises, my brother gets more on Social Security than I even. His raise is bigger than what I even get, which I don't care because I own a small business and I'll be the 23rd of this month. I'll be 79, so I ain't gonna live too much longer anyway. So.
All right, Robert. Thank you for calling in, sir. Senator Coburn.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that he made, how fair is it if we're trying to stimulate the economy? Why do we give somebody that pays taxes on $109,000 in Social Security, $2,100, and somebody that's paying? If we really want to stimulate the economy, why don't we do a refundable tax credit? And those that really don't, it isn't going to change their discretionary payment. I mean, if the idea is to give the money back to people to increase the economy, in other words, to get them to spend it, do the very wealthy that have earned income, is it going to make a change in their pattern of purchasing by doing the 2%? And so, we ought to have an income limit on this, number one, and then we ought to do it through a tax credit rather than Social Security. One other point your listeners may not know, this is $117 billion last year. We went into the market, the world financial market, and borrowed the money to replace the money that we didn't pay into Social Security. Now, everybody knows we've been stealing from Social Security for years, right? $2.6 trillion has actually been stolen out of Social Security, and IOUs have been put there. When we put that money back in, we get no credit. So actually, we're going to pay for this twice. We're going to pay for the actual loan, and then because we're not getting any credit for putting the $117 billion in, our children are still going to pay back the $117 billion that was part of the $2.6 trillion. So we've actually hit our kids twice with the way we're doing this from an accounting standpoint. So it costs them twice. So it's costing $234 billion, not $117 billion, if you're a generation down the road or a generation and a half down the road, like my grandkids from 16 to 2. They're going to pay twice as much as what we're actually getting the benefit for. So it's silly.
Houston, Lee, Democrat. You are on the Washington Journal with Senator Tom Coburn, Republican of Oklahoma.
Yeah, I want to start off by saying the reason we're in this mess, it started with the Bush administration. And people should know by now that tax breaks and tax cuts does not work. Since the Bush administration, we're still in the same situation. Let's be honest about that. And the real thing that we should do is just get rid of tax breaks for everybody. Just let's go back to the Clinton years. And because I have a friend that's a small business owner, and he says he does not see the tax break. So if you're going to say tax breaks, tell me how much money that you're giving for tax breaks. And another question, when y'all say American people, if you're a Republican, you saying the American people, you're not talking about me because you don't represent me. I'd rather for y'all to say the Republican of the United States and Democrats, but quit saying the American people because you're not representing all the American people because of your views. And
all right, Lee, you know what? We got the 2 points. Thank you for calling in. Senator Coburn?
Well, it's a pretty novel approach. If you're a Republican, you can't represent the American people. You know, I would tell you a lot of people in Oklahoma who disagree with me, and there's a lot, can still believe I can represent their viewpoints. So I would dispute your second statement, and I'm really sorry you feel that way because that comes from injury, disappointment. Look, we started getting in trouble in the late 60s, and it's not Republican or Democrat. When we can double the size of the federal government over the last 10 years, and that's Republican and Democratic administrations, both have responsibility for that, and we cannot figure out a way to pay for it as we do it. That's a problem of failed leadership in terms of Congress. 1, not communicating that to the American people. 2, not doing the oversight. 3, not creating the bills to do it. You know, there are a lot of lessons in life, but the one thing is you're going to ultimately pay for everything you buy, one way or the other, whether it's a promise. I mean, just think about what we've done just since in the mid-70s. When Medicare started, the average life expectancy of somebody on Medicare was 70 years of age. And of course, that's now 79. The average employer and employee couple pay in $110,000 to Medicare. And when we first started it, what we were paying out was about the same. Now we pay in $110,000, and the average couple takes out $350,000. How long do you think Medicare is going to last? The hospital trust fund is going to be bankrupt in less than 5 years. And so everybody says, don't touch Medicare, don't touch Social Security, don't fix these things. That's because they're fearful, because they're dependent on it. And what we have to do is quit letting the politicians, for partisan gain, enhance the fear of people losing. Nobody in Washington wants anybody who's totally dependent on either of those 2 programs to suffer anything by what we do. But that doesn't mean we don't have to fix them for the future, and we don't have to make major changes to them to make sure they are viable. And we can do that. All of us are going to give it a little something if we're going to get out of the hole we're in. Everybody's going to see something different. The very rich are going to see something different. Those that are on benefit programs that are questionable whether or not they're eligible, they're probably not going to be on there anymore. Those that are truly dependent, we're going to continue to help, but we have to adjust that. Otherwise, if we don't do that, when it comes to the day of reckoning on our debt, when we're starting to be looked at like Europe's looked at today, somebody else will be telling us what we'll do. Not your elected representatives. The international financial world will be telling us. So I think it's better for us to take what the pain that we're going to have to take and make sure it's meted out in the proper order than take much more severe pain. When I talk to my colleagues on the other side, and some of my closest colleagues are the most liberal, I find them more intellectually honest oftentimes, the very people they want to help, unless we change these now, are the very people who are going to get hurt if we don't fix it. So what I would tell you is what we have to do is rebuild confidence so we have people up here who actually see the whole picture and want to support those that need us the most.
Ronald Gums tweets into you, Senator, didn't the Board of Trustees of Social Security state that the payroll tax extension has no effect on the trust fund?
Well, they did state it, but that's because we're borrowing money. Whatever we borrow, whatever we don't collect in terms of taxes, we're borrowing from your children. So no, it doesn't have any effect on the trust fund right now. It has an effect on your children. I mean, that's a false economy. Remember, every dollar you borrow today, you're going to pay back with interest. And if it's over 30 years, if you compound 1.04% over 30 years, they're going to pay back twice as much as we're spending today. The worst thing we can do is to borrow money and increase programs now and pay for it over a long period of time because we can't even manage the debt we have now. In other words, there's going to come a point in time when our interest rates are going to skyrocket. Why would we set ourselves up to be Greece? And so they're saying it doesn't have any effect because we're borrowing again. We're stealing from our children today to give this tax credit. That's exactly what we're doing. And that's what we did last year. We went out into the market and borrowed $107 billion to fill the hole. And so it didn't have any effect on the trust fund. But they also said is we're not getting any credit for the $107 billion we're putting in there against what we stole. So there's another $107 billion that our kids are going to get to pay back that we've not getting credit for. So that's why it costs twice as much.
What's been the effect of Grover Norquist's tax pledge on the Republican Party?
Well, I think two things. One is it's been highly exaggerated by the press because it's a good fight, which is really disappointing. It's not the truth. It's not accurate. If people stood up him tomorrow, he doesn't have the resources to affect hardly any elections other than to complain about it. And I would tell every Republican out there, if you think in this time of divided government that we're not going to be able to come to an agreement without some revenue increases, that you might as well go find another country to live in. There is no way we're going to solve our problems without compromise. And part of that compromise is we're going to have more revenues. And you can do it any way you want. I mean, so it's like sticking your head in the sand. You're not going to get 60 Tom Coburns in the U.S. Senate to be able to pass something like that. It ain't never going to happen. So what is the obvious? We have immediate problems that need to be solved. We need compromise now. Every year we wait to fix this problem makes the problem that much more difficult. So I think he's been highly exaggerated in terms of his influence, and he's highly inconsistent in terms of his effect. And I think you're going to see, I mean, you saw the super committee, you saw Pat Toomey, former Club for Growth president, offer up almost $350 billion worth of real revenue increases. I don't think it had any effect on Pat Toomey. And I don't think it would anybody if it actually solved the problem. The problem is they're not going there until they actually can solve the problem.
And this final Twitter comment from the hippie. I bet all this interest in Coburn running for president has more to do with the awful GOP field than it does with Coburn's virtues.
Probably so.
Senator Tom Coburn, a regular guest here on the Washington Journal. We appreciate your coming over and talking with our viewers as always. Hour and a half left to go in the Washington Journal. We have our final segment today at 9:15 a.m. Eastern Time. Historian Richard Brookhiser will be here to talk about his magazine article / book on James Madison. We'll get some then and now comparisons, I hope. But coming up next, Representative Yarmouth, Democrat of Kentucky, to continue our discussion on